poor little black girl, 8 years old, stood on a street corner in the freezing rain trying to sell the last flowers her grandmother would ever grow. A billionaire sat in the back of a parked car across the street and watched her through the glass. He did not roll down his window. He did not call her over. He did not send his driver across with a folded bill. He just watched. And she had no idea that the man behind that tinted glass owned half the buildings on the avenue, or that in the space of a single rain-soaked minute, she would crack open a door inside him that he had welded shut 30 years before, and that nothing for either of them would ever be quite the same again. 58-year-old Augustus Vane had not built a $6 billion hospitality empire by letting himself feel things on a Tuesday morning. He had built it by feeling as little as possible, for as long as possible, about as many people as possible. At 20 minutes to 7, he sat in the back of a charcoal Bentley, idling at the curb of an old district where wrought iron lampposts leaned like tired men, waiting on an assistant who had run into a shuttered building to retrieve a set of signed papers. The seats were heated to the exact temperature he preferred. The cabin smelled of cedar and the bitter espresso his staff prepared in a thermos before dawn. His overcoat was cashmere the color of wet slate, cut by a tailor in London with a 2-year waiting list and no listed phone number. On his wrist sat a watch worth more than the entire block of failing shops outside the window, and he had bought it for himself because Augustus Vane had no family, no heir, and no one alive who would ever pass anything down to him. He was alone. He was always alone. He had spent a great deal of money making sure it stayed that way. Vane Group owned 41 luxury hotels, 3 resort islands, and a long portfolio of historic buildings he bought, restored, and leased back to the city at a profit. He had a reputation as a man who never made the same mistake twice and never forgave the first one. He had started with nothing, a single rented room above a laundromat, a borrowed suit, and the willingness to work until his hands shook. His mother had sold cut flowers from a dented tin bucket on a street corner 6 days a week, in heat and in snow, and she had died before she ever lived to see him own so much as a parked car. His father he did not remember and did not discuss. He knew somewhere far down what it was to be cold and to count coins in a palm and come up short. But that was a long time ago, and he had buried it under 30 years of glass and steel and silence, and he preferred it stay buried. 10 years earlier, a partner named Royce Calloway had nearly taken everything from him. Calloway had been his right hand, the only man Augustus had ever trusted enough to call a friend, the one who stood beside him at every opening and once, long ago, beside him at his mother's grave. They had built the resort division together, shoulder to shoulder, through years of 100-hour weeks. And then the accountants found it, 16 hidden accounts, inflated invoices, 11 years of quiet theft. The betrayal cost Augustus more than the $31 million. It cost him the last working part of his heart that had still believed a person could be trusted at all. Charm is the cheapest currency in the world, he liked to say afterward. That's exactly why it buys nothing. He said it in boardrooms. He said it to journalists. He said it to his own reflection on the mornings when something soft tried to climb back into his chest, and he beat it down with the saying the way you'd beat down a weed. People wanted things. People performed. The only safe thing to do with a human being was to keep the glass between you and them rolled all the way up. So that was where the glass was that morning, rolled all the way up, when his eyes drifted across the rain-blurred street and landed, with no particular interest at first, on a small figure standing at the far corner under no shelter at all. A little girl. Maybe 7, maybe 8. Brown skin, 2 careful braids gone heavy and dripping with rain, a yellow raincoat a size too big with the hood blown back off her head. She stood beside an overturned crate, and on the crate sat a tin pail, and in the pail, shielded by her own small body bent over them like a question mark, was a bundle of flowers. She was not crying. She was not waving anyone down. She was simply standing in the freezing rain, guarding something, the way a person guards the only thing they have left. Augustus Vane felt something move behind his ribs that he had no name for and did not welcome. His driver, a quiet man named Hollis who had worked for him for 13 years, caught the direction of his employer's gaze in the mirror. "Cold morning to have a child out selling anything," Hollis said. He did not expect an answer, and for a long moment he did not get one. Across the street, the little girl shifted her weight from one soaked sneaker to the other. The pail at her feet held perhaps a dozen bundles of flowers, no more, and even from across the avenue and through the rain-streaked glass Augustus could see that they were good flowers, real ones, the kind grown slowly by someone's hands and not flown in cold from a wholesaler. White ones, mostly, and a few deep reds, wrapped at the stems in twists of newspaper. The girl had built a little tent of clear plastic over the top of the pail, The way you'd build shelter for something more important than yourself. And every minute or so, she leaned down to check that the plastic was holding, that the rain was running off and not getting in. She was keeping the flowers dry. She was not keeping herself dry at all. A man in a good coat hurried past her on the sidewalk, head down, phone to his ear, and did not slow. A woman with an umbrella stepped around the crate without looking at it. A bus hissed by and threw a sheet of gray water that the girl turned her shoulder against, curling her whole small body over the pail to take the splash on her back so the flowers would take none of it. Then she straightened, peeled back one corner of the plastic, checked the white ones underneath, and Augustus saw it clearly 14 feet away through 2 panes of glass. Her shoulders dropped half an inch in relief. They were dry. She tucked the plastic back down and stood up straight again, chin lifted, waiting for the next person who would walk past her without stopping. Augustus knew that gesture. He knew it the way you know your own name. He had watched his mother make it 10,000 times, bend over the bucket, check the blooms, straighten up, lift the chin, wait. Flowers first. Always the flowers first. The memory came up out of him without permission, 30 years buried, and arrived all at once, clear as the glass in front of his face. He was 7 years old. It was winter. The man who delivered flowers from the grower's market had stopped coming when his mother couldn't pay the delivery fee. And so on Saturdays, she had walked to the market herself and carried the heavy buckets back 2 at a time, switching hands when her fingers went numb, because a bucket that didn't reach the corner was money she didn't have. He remembered her coming through the door of their single rented room with her hands the raw red color of meat, and setting the buckets down with terrible care, and only then, only after the flowers were safe in water, sitting down and pressing those ruined hands between her knees to thaw them. She had checked the flowers first. She had checked them first even on the morning of the day she finally got too sick to stand, and there had been no money for the specialist, and Augustus had been 19 years old and could do nothing at all but watch her go. He had not let himself think about her chapped red hands in 3 decades. He was thinking about them now, helplessly, because a little black girl in a too big yellow raincoat was standing across the street keeping flowers dry with her own freezing body, and she had her chin lifted in exactly the way his mother used to lift hers, and the rain was coming down on her and she was not making a single sound of complaint. "Sir," Holly said. His employer had gone very still in the back seat, one hand pressed flat against the window glass without seeming to know it was there. Augustus did not answer right away. The whole machinery of the man he had become for 30 years told him to look away. A child selling flowers in the rain was not his problem. He did not get involved. He did not roll the glass down. Charm was free, and so were sad stories, and a man who let every wet face on a street corner reach him would have nothing left of himself by noon. He had heard that voice for 30 years and obeyed it for 30 years, and it had kept him perfectly safe and perfectly alone behind perfectly clear glass. But the little girl bent over the pail again to check the flowers, and the chin came up again, and Augustus Vane discovered that some doors, once you have welded them shut, will still come open if the right small hand knocks in exactly the right way. "Holly's," he said. His own voice sounded strange to him. "Who is that child? Where does she come from?" "Couldn't say, sir." Holly's paused, watching the mirror. "But that shop right behind her, the one with the green sign, that's a flower shop. Eddie's, I'd guess that's where she comes from." Augustus looked at the faded sign over the shuttered-looking little storefront, and at the girl standing guard in front of it, and he did not look away this time. Section 310, for 30 years, Augustus Vane had not opened his own car door. There was always someone to do it, Holly's, a doorman, an assistant hovering at the curb. So when his hand found the handle that morning and pulled, the small mechanical click of it sounded enormous in the quiet cabin, like something breaking. "Sir," Holly said, half turning, "the rain, let me get the umbrella," but Augustus was already stepping out into it. The cold hit him the way it had not hit him in decades. He had insulated himself against weather the way he had insulated himself against everything else, with heated leather and cashmere and tinted glass. And now the rain came down on the slate-gray coat that had never once been rained on, and soaked through the shoulders, and ran cold down the back of his neck, and he found that he did not mind it. He crossed the avenue between 2 slow-moving cars, a tall, silver-haired man in a coat worth more than the building behind the girl, and he came to a stop in front of the overturned crate and the tin pail, and the child bent over it. She looked up at him. She was not frightened, or if she was, she did not show it. She had the steady, sizing-up look of a person much older than 8, the look of a child who had learned early that the world was full of strangers, and that some of them helped and most of them didn't, and that you could not always tell which was which by the coat. "Morning, mister," she said. "You want flowers, they're real ones. My grandma grew 'em. They don't smell like the fake kind." She lifted one bundle out of the pail, careful to keep the rest covered, and held it up to him in two small hands. "These white ones are the best. They bruise the easiest, so I keep 'em on the bottom, but they're the prettiest ones we got." Augustus looked at the flowers and then at the girl, and his throat had gone tight in a way it had not in 30 years. "What's your name?" he asked. His own voice came out lower than he meant it to. "Maya," she said. "Maya Quinn, what's yours?" "Augustus." She considered this. "That's a big name." "It is," he agreed. "How much for the white ones?" $2 a bunch. She said it like a fact she'd memorized and would not negotiate the way you'd state your own address. "But if you buy 3, my grandma says you get the 4th one free. That's good business," she says. "You make the customer feel like they won something." A sound came out of Augustus that he had not made in years. It was not quite a laugh, but it was its cousin. "Your grandmother sounds like she knows business." "She knows everything," Maya said simply. "She taught me how to cut the stems so the flowers drink more water, and how to know which ones are gonna open and which ones already opened too much, and how to wrap them in the newspaper so they don't get squished." She glanced down at the pail, checked the plastic, straightened up again. "She would be out here herself, but she's sick. She gets real tired and her chest does a thing. So I'm doing the selling till she's better. I'm pretty good at it." A small shadow crossed her face, there and gone. "I sold 6 bunches yesterday. Today's slower 'cause of the rain. People don't stop in the rain." "No," Augustus said quietly. "They don't." He stood there in the downpour, this man who had spent a decade believing that the only honest thing a person ever did was what they did when no one was watching, and he understood all at once and far too late in his life that he had been a coward dressed up as a philosopher. He had built a whole religion out of staying behind glass. He had told himself it was wisdom, and it had only ever been fear wearing a very good coat. "Maya," he said, "how sick is your grandmother?" The girl looked up at him, and for the first time her composure thinned, just slightly, just enough to show the 8-year-old underneath the small businesswoman. "There's a doctor she's supposed to see," she said. "A special one. But he costs a lot, and the shop's not making enough, and they sent us a letter on the heavy paper that says the building's gonna get knocked down soon, so Grandma says we have to sell everything we can while we can." She lifted her chin in exactly the way his mother used to lift hers. "That's why I'm out here even when it rains. Every bunch I sell is part of the doctor." Augustus Vane looked down at the child, and the rain ran off both of them, and somewhere far back inside him a door that had been welded shut for 30 years swung the rest of the way open. "How many flowers do you have left in that pail?" he asked. Maya counted, lips moving. 11 bunches. "I'll take all 11, Augustus said. "And then, if you'll let me, I'd like to meet the woman who taught you to keep the white ones dry." Maya led him into the shop, holding the door for the tall stranger the way her grandmother had taught her to hold doors. And Augustus Vane stepped out of the rain and into a room that smelled of eucalyptus and damp earth and something green and living, and the smell undid him more thoroughly than the cold had. It was the smell of his entire childhood. It was the smell of his mother's hands. The shop was small and worn and immaculately cared for. The floor was swept. The buckets along the wall were arranged by color. A hand-lettered sign behind the counter read "Fresh cut, grown here" in a careful, old-fashioned hand. And beside it hung a child's drawing of 3 flowers in a pot, signed Maya in crayon. With a heart over the eye, everything in the room said the same thing the girl had said on the corner. "We do not have much, but what we have, we tend." In a chair by the back room doorway sat an old woman wrapped in a knitted shawl, and she rose when they came in, one hand going to the doorframe to steady herself. She was perhaps 80, thin in the way illness makes people thin, with silver hair pulled back and eyes that were sharp and clear and missed nothing. She looked at her granddaughter, soaked to the skin, and then at the silver-haired man in the ruined, expensive coat standing in her doorway, and Augustus watched her do the same fast arithmetic the child had done on the corner, friend or trouble, helper or harm. "Maya," the old woman said, "baby, you're soaked through. I told you when it comes down that hard, you come inside." Her voice was gentle, but it carried a tremor underneath, and when she finished speaking her breath caught and she pressed a hand to her chest until it passed. "I sold everything, Grandma," Maya said, and there was such pride in it that the room seemed to brighten. "All of it. This is Augustus. He has a big name and he bought all 11 bunches and he wanted to meet you because I told him you taught me about the white ones." The old woman looked at Augustus for a long moment. "Edith Quinn," she said, and did not offer her hand because she did not yet know what kind of man he was. "You bought out the whole pail." "I did," Augustus said. "Then I owe you an honest accounting." Edith's chin came up, the same chin, the same gesture, and Augustus understood now where the girl had learned it. Those are good flowers, the best I've grown, but they're the last I'll grow in this shop. We've got to notice. The building's bought and slated to come down, and the new owner's some company that sends letters and never answers a phone, so there's no use my pretending to you that this is a business with a future. You bought 11 bunches of beautiful flowers from a shop that's closing. I'll not have you thinking you bought into something it isn't. She did not know, could not have known, that the company that sent letters and never answered a phone was his. That the demolition order with her shop's address on it had crossed his own desk among 100 others. A single line on a redevelopment schedule, a building, a number, a thing to be flattened so that something more profitable could rise. He had signed off on it without ever once seeing the green sign, or the swept floor, or the buckets sorted by color, or the child's drawing with the heart over the eye. Augustus Vane stood in that small, fragrant room and felt the full weight of his own life settle onto his shoulders like a wet coat. He had spent 30 years building an empire so vast it could have saved 1,000 women like his mother. And he had used that empire, among other things, to put a death sentence on a flower shop run by a sick old woman and an 8-year-old without ever knowing or caring that they existed, because they had only ever been a line on a page that no one made him read aloud. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "What's the name of the company on the letter?" Edith's eyes narrowed slightly. She crossed to the counter, lifted a heavy cream envelope from where it sat weighted under a stone, and held it out. He took it. He did not need to read it. He knew the letterhead the way he knew his own signature, because his own signature was on 1,000 documents bearing exactly that crest. Vane Group Hospitality. For a moment, Augustus could not speak at all. "You know it," Edith said. It was not a question. She had read his face the way she read everything, completely. "I know it," Augustus said. "I'm the man who owns it." The room went very quiet. Maya looked between the two adults, sensing the air change without understanding it, and reached up to take her grandmother's hand. Edith Quinn did not flinch. She looked at the billionaire standing in her doorway in his soaked, ruined coat, the man whose company had condemned everything she had ever built, and she said, with the terrible steadiness of someone who had nothing left to lose and would not beg for it anyway, "Then I suppose, Mr. Vane, you've come to see what you're knocking down." "No," Augustus said. "I came in out of the rain because of a little girl and a pail of flowers, and I did not know whose shop I was walking into until 30 seconds ago." He set the cream envelope back down on the counter, gently, as if it might break. "I want to say that plainly, Mrs. Quinn, because I think you're a woman who values plainness. I did not come here to gloat over what I'm tearing down. I came here because your granddaughter held up a bunch of white flowers in the rain and reminded me of someone I have spent 30 years trying not to remember." Edith studied him. The sharpness in her eyes did not soften, but it shifted, the way a person's gaze shifts when they are revising an opinion in real time. "And who would that be?" "My mother." The word came out of him rough, unused. "She sold cut flowers from a tin bucket on a corner, 6 days a week in every kind of weather. She kept the flowers dry and let herself get soaked, exactly the way Maya was doing out there just now. She got sick the way you're sick. There was a doctor she needed and we couldn't pay for him, and she died before I had 2 coins to rub together, let alone..." He gestured vaguely at the coat, the watch, the whole impossible weight of everything he owned, all of this. He stopped. "I built all of this, and I built it into a thing that signs papers to knock down flower shops without ever reading the address. I didn't know your shop existed until I walked in the door. That's not an excuse. It's worse than an excuse. It's the truth." Maya, still holding her grandmother's hand, looked up at him with enormous eyes. "You're the one knocking down our shop?" she asked, and there was no anger in it, only a child's bewildered effort to make the pieces fit. "But you bought all my flowers." "Yes," Augustus said. He crouched down then, slowly, an old man in a wet coat lowering himself to a little girl's eye level, something Hollies would later swear he had never once seen the man do. "I did both of those things, Maya, and one of them was wrong. So I'm going to fix it. Is that all right with you?" Maya considered this with great seriousness. "What does fix it mean?" "It means the shop doesn't come down," Augustus said. "Not this month, not next year. It means your grandmother sees that special doctor this week, and not because anyone's doing you a favor, but because I owe it to her, and to somebody I couldn't help a long time ago. And it means that if your grandmother's willing, I'd like to buy flowers from this shop every single week, for all 41 of my hotels, so that you never have to stand on a corner in the freezing rain to pay for a doctor again." He paused. "But your grandmother runs this shop, not me, so she gets to say yes or no. That's how it should be." Edith Quinn lowered herself slowly back into her chair. Her hand had not let go of Maya's. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and Augustus let the silence stand, because he had learned that morning, finally, the difference between filling a silence to get something and holding one to give someone room. "Mr. Vane," Edith said at last, "I have lived 81 years, and I have learned to be suspicious of rich men who arrive wet and remorseful and full of promises. Promises are cheap." She let that land. "But you didn't come in here promising. You came in here confessing, which is a rarer and more expensive thing. A man who lies will tell you what you want to hear. He doesn't usually walk into a stranger's shop and announce he's the one who's been trying to tear it down." She drew a slow, careful breath, the kind that cost her something. "So I'll believe you for now on a trial." "That's fair," Augustus said, "and we don't take charity in this shop." Edith's chin came up one more time, and Maya's came up with it, unconsciously a mirror. "Whatever you do for me and that baby, it's an advance against flowers we'll grow and deliver and earn. Every penny of that doctor gets paid back in white blooms and red ones. You understand me? Maya, you understand your grandmother?" "Yes, Grandma," Maya said. "Then it's settled," Edith said, "as far as a thing can be settled between two people who met 15 minutes ago." And then, because she was who she was, she added, "Now take that coat off before you catch your death standing there dripping, and Maya, put the kettle on. We don't let a customer leave this shop cold, even if he's a billionaire. Especially if he's a billionaire. Lord knows nobody's offered that man a hot drink in years." And Augustus Vane, owner of 41 hotels, 3 islands, and a watch worth more than the block, took off his ruined coat in a tiny flower shop he had been about to demolish, and let an 8-year-old make him tea, and felt, for the first time in 30 years, something that was almost certainly warmth. The specialist saw Edith Quinn that Thursday. He was the kind of doctor who normally booked 4 months out, in an office with a saltwater aquarium in the waiting room and a view of the river. And Edith arrived to find that her appointment had somehow materialized in 3 days, that the consultation fee had been settled in advance against an account she did not recognize, and that the receptionist treated her with the slightly nervous deference usually reserved for people who knew people. She submitted to all of it with her chin up, taking notes in a small pad, fully intending, as she told Meyer in the cab on the way home, to pay back every dollar in flowers if it took her until she was 100. The cough had a name. The name was serious, but it was not the worst name, and the doctor said 2 things that changed the shape of the Quinn's world. The first was that it was treatable. The second was that it should have been treated months ago, and that a few more winters of standing in tin bucket cold would very likely have taken it past treating. Edith heard that second part in silence, and then she went home and sat in her chair for a long while with Maya's hand in hers, thinking about how close a margin a life can run on, and how it sometimes comes down to whether a particular stranger happens to glance out of a particular car window on a particular rainy morning. She did not say any of that to Maya. She said, "Well, baby, looks like your grandmother's going to be a nuisance to you for a good while yet." And Maya, who understood more than the adults around her ever gave her credit for, climbed into the chair beside her and held on and did not let go for an hour. The shop did not come down. The demolition order, when Augustus pulled the file, turned out to be one line in a redevelopment plan covering the entire block. 11 properties his acquisitions team had bought quietly over 2 years for the land beneath them. He sat in his office on the 41st floor with the file open in front of him and looked at the addresses for a long time, all 11 of them, each one a number, each one a thing he had never made himself see. Then he picked up the phone and called his head of real estate, a sharp woman named Delia Maddox, and told her the Marlowe Street project was off. There was a silence on the line. "Augustus," Delia said carefully, "we're 18 months and several $1 million into assembling that parcel. The board approved the tower. What do I tell them?" "Tell them I read one of the addresses," Augustus said, "and I'm not knocking it down." He paused, "and freeze the rents on the whole block at their original rates. 10-year terms for any tenant who wants to stay. We'll find another corner for the tower. We don't need to flatten a flower shop and 10 of its neighbors to make our money. We just got used to it being easy." He could hear her recalibrating on the other end, hear 13 years of certainty about who Augustus Vane was being quietly revised. "That's not," she started and then stopped and then said, "That's not how you usually do things." "No," Augustus agreed. "It isn't. Let's see if I can learn to do them differently before I run out of time." Word of the standing flower order moved through Vane Group with the speed that strange news always moves through large companies. The CEO, the man who had not been seen to feel a thing in a decade, the man whose own people called him the glacier behind his back, had personally arranged for all 41 hotels in the region to source their fresh arrangements from a single tiny shop on Marlow Street run by a sick old woman and a child. Nobody knew the details. Everybody had a theory. Most of the theories were unkind, because that was the kind of company Augustus had built, one where a billionaire helping a flower shop was assumed to be a tax dodge or a scheme before it was ever assumed to be a kindness. Augustus heard the theories. He found, to his surprise, that he did not much care. What he cared about, increasingly, was Thursdays. Because somewhere in those first weeks it had become a habit, and then something more than a habit, for him to have Hollies drive him to Marlow Street on Thursday mornings, ostensibly to review the delivery logistics, actually to sit on a stool in a small shop that smelled of eucalyptus and drink tea that an 8-year-old made too strong, and listen to Edith Quinn tell him exactly what she thought of his hotel's flower budgets, his posture, and his refusal to eat a proper breakfast. He had not been spoken to that way by anyone in 30 years. He had not laughed in a flower shop in 30 years. He had not, in 30 years, been anywhere on a Thursday morning that he simply wanted to be. "You're getting color back in your face, Mr. Vane," Edith observed one Thursday, watching him over the rim of her cup. "When you first walked in here, you looked like a man made out of glass." She set the cup down. "Glass doesn't keep anybody warm, not even the man inside it." Augustus looked at her, and at the little girl wrapping white flowers at the counter, and he found he had no argument to make at all. There were people inside Vane Group who did not like what was happening to Augustus, and chief among them was a senior vice president named Royce Calloway's successor, a man named Bertram Voss, who had built his career on the company being exactly the kind of company it had always been. Voss managed the Regional Acquisitions Division. The Marlow Street Tower had been his project, his 18 months, his expected bonus, and when it died in a single phone call, he did not forgive it, and he did not forget who had killed it. He could not attack the decision directly. Augustus owned the company did what Augustus said. So Voss did what men like him always do. He went looking for the rot underneath. It did not take him long to find the flower shop's books, the lease history, the frozen rents, the standing order that paid a Marlow Street florist a sum that, spread across 41 hotels, was almost invisible but, looked at in one place, looked like exactly what Voss wanted it to look like. He found the canceled demolition. He found the prepaid medical account. He assembled it all into a tidy folder, the way men like him assemble things, and he brought it to a meeting of the senior leadership on the 41st floor, and he laid it on the table with the satisfaction of a man who believes he is about to do something brave. "I think the board needs to be aware," Voss said, "of a pattern of decisions that appear to be personal, not commercial." He slid the folder toward the center of the table. "A killed project worth tens of millions. Frozen rents across an entire block at a direct loss. A vendor contract steered to a single unqualified shop, and I'll just say it, a medical bill paid by the company for the proprietor of that shop. I'm sure there's an explanation, but from the outside it looks like the chief executive is running a charity out of shareholder funds. And charity," he added with a small, cold smile, "is the cheapest thing in the world. Doesn't cost the giver a thing but other people's money." He had chosen that last line deliberately. He knew the boss's old saying. He thought he was turning it against him. Augustus Vane sat at the head of the table and let the folder sit there in the center, unopened, for a long moment. He had spent 30 years being exactly the man Voss was appealing to, the man who would have looked at that folder and seen weakness, sentiment, a liability to be cut. He knew that man intimately. He had been that man longer than Maya Quinn had been alive. "You're right about one thing, Bertram," Augustus said at last. "It is personal." He looked around the table at the careful, neutral faces of people who had learned long ago to wait and see which way the glacier was going to move. "I want to tell you all something, and then we're going to vote, and you can vote however your conscience tells you, and I'll abide by it for everything except the things that are already done, because those are not coming undone. 30 years ago, my mother sold flowers from a bucket on a corner and died of an illness we couldn't afford to treat. I have spent every year since then making certain I would never be that powerless again. And somewhere in the making certain, I became a man who could sign a paper to demolish a flower shop and never even read the address. A few weeks ago, I read the address. It belonged to a sick old woman and her 8-year-old granddaughter, and the little girl was standing in freezing rain selling the last flowers in the place because they needed the money for a doctor. He paused. "I have spent 30 years saying that charm is the cheapest currency in the world, and I was right about that, but I had the conclusion exactly backwards. I thought it meant you should trust nothing and no one." What it actually means is that the cheap things, words, charm, a saying you repeat in a boardroom to sound hard, those are worthless. And the expensive things are the ones that cost you something to do. Reading the address costs something. Killing your own profitable tower costs something. So does an 8-year-old standing in the rain to keep flowers dry for a grandmother who needs her. He looked directly at Voss. You called it charity and you meant it as an insult. I'll take the word. But understand the difference. Charity is loose change you toss from a warm car. What I'm doing is a correction. And a correction is the most expensive thing a man can pay because the only currency it takes is admitting you were wrong. The room was silent. Voss had gone pale. The folder sat unopened in the center of the table, and somehow it had become not Augustus's indictment but his own. Now, Augustus said almost gently, you wanted a vote. Let's vote. All in favor of the chief executive of this company being permitted to read the addresses of the buildings he tears down, raise your hand. Slowly, around the table, one hand went up. Then another. Then most of them. Bertram Voss did not raise his hand, but it no longer mattered, and from the look on his face, he knew it. After the meeting, Augustus did something else he had not done in 30 years. He did not have Hollies drive him home to the silent penthouse with the view and the cedar smell and the espresso thermos. He had Hollies drive him to Marlowe Street, on a Wednesday, with no delivery logistics to review and no excuse prepared. And he sat on the stool in the warm, fragrant shop and told Edith Quinn what had happened in the boardroom, the way a person tells someone whose opinion has come to matter to him. Edith listened to the whole thing, wrapping stems while he talked, the way she always did. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. So a man tried to use your own hardness against you, she said, and found out you'd gone and gotten soft when he wasn't looking. Something like that. Good. She tied off a bundle and set it aside. A man your age, with your money, who's just now learning to feel things, that's a dangerous time, Mr. Vane. You'll either let it crack you all the way open and become someone worth knowing, or you'll get scared of the feeling and seal yourself right back up, and the second one's easier, and most men your age choose it. She fixed him with that clear, sharp look. Don't choose the easy one. You're better than the easy one. I can tell. Maya can tell, and that child has never been wrong about a person in her life. At the counter, Maya looked up from her drawing. I drawed you, she announced, and held up a sheet of paper. It was a crayon picture of 3 figures standing in front of a flower shop with a green sign. A tall figure with silver hair, rendered as a gray scribble, holding the hand of a small figure with 2 braids, and beside them an old woman in a chair, and over all of it a yellow sun pushing through gray rain. Underneath, in careful, uneven letters, she had written, My friends. Augustus Vane took the drawing in 2 hands the way the child had once held up the white flowers to him in the rain. Looked at it for a long time. He had a watch worth more than the block and 3 islands in 2 oceans and 41 hotels, and he understood, holding a piece of crayon paper that an 8-year-old had labeled My Friends, that he had never in his life owned anything worth a tenth of it. May I keep this? He asked, and his voice was not steady at all. That's why I drawed it, Maya said, as if this were obvious. It's for your office. Grandma says your office probably doesn't have anything happy in it. Your grandmother, Augustus said, is right about a great many things. He framed the drawing. He hung it on the wall of the 41st floor office where deals worth hundreds of millions had been made and unmade in silence, between a window full of city and a shelf full of awards, and visitors sometimes glanced at it and could not work out why a crayon picture of a flower shop hung in such a place. And Augustus never explained it because the people who needed to understand it already did. The treatment worked the way good things tend to, slowly, unglamorously, day by day. Edith's chest eased. The cough loosened its grip. By the time the rains gave way to spring, she could walk the length of the shop without stopping for breath, and by summer she could tend the long greenhouse boxes behind the building again, though she let Maya do the heavy watering now and supervised from a chair in the doorway, which she insisted was the most important job and which everyone allowed her to believe. The shop did not just survive, it grew. 41 hotels need a great many flowers, and Edith Quinn's hands could not grow them all, so she did what she had always told Maya good business did. She made the customer's need into the shop's strength. She hired help. She brought on 3 people from the neighborhood, 2 of them mothers raising children alone who had been turned down by everyone else in the city. And she paid them properly and taught them to cut the stems at the right angle and to keep the white ones on the bottom. And the little failing storefront on the condemned block became a real and thriving business, the first of its kind any of them had ever had a share in. And every penny of the doctor got paid back, exactly as Edith had sworn it would, in white blooms and red ones delivered weekly, billed honestly, an old woman's pride settled in full. Augustus tried once to wave the debt away, and Edith looked at him over her teacup with such withering clarity that he never tried again. "We are not a charity, Mr. Vane," she said. "We are a flower shop with a very strange new friend. There's a difference, and you of all people ought to know it by now." He did. He had learned it in a boardroom and learned it again in this very chair. And he was learning it, he suspected, a little more every Thursday for the rest of what was turning out to be a far better life than the one he'd built behind the glass. The years went by the way good years do, quietly and without drama, which is its own kind of miracle when you have lived through the other kind. Edith Quinn lived to see the spring after that, and the spring after that one too. She lived to scold Maya for cutting the white ones at the wrong angle, and to take it all back an hour later when they opened beautifully anyway. She lived to see the shop on Marlowe Street become the anchor of a block that Vane Group never demolished, a block that Augustus, to the bafflement of his board and the eventual grudging admiration of the city, restored instead, frozen rents and all, until the failing little stretch of storefronts became a place people actually wanted to be. There is no medicine for being 81, but there is a great deal of medicine in being needed, and in watching something you built refuse to die. And Edith had both in abundance, every single day, until the very end of a long and unhurried life. When she did go, finally, it was in her own chair by the backroom doorway, in the smell of eucalyptus and green growing things, with Maya's hand in hers and Augustus Vane standing in the room he had once come to tear down. And she went the way she had lived, with her chin up and no complaints anyone could hear. At the funeral, Augustus stood beside Maya, who was 13 by then and nearly as tall as the buckets, and when the girl's hand found his and held on, the billionaire who had buried his own mother alone at 19 with no money and no one beside him discovered that grief, when it is shared, is a different and more bearable thing than the grief he had carried locked behind glass for 30 years. He had not been able to help his mother. He had been able to give Edith Quinn 6 good years she would not otherwise have had, and a granddaughter raised in a home that was warm and a shop that did not close, and that, he understood at last, was the only kind of correction the world ever truly allows, not to undo the loss behind you, but to refuse to let it repeat in front of you. Maya grew up in that shop. She grew up wrapping stems and sorting buckets by color and telling customers that if they bought 3 bunches, the 4th one was free, because it made the customer feel like they'd won something, just as her grandmother had taught her. She grew up with Augustus Vane at the edge of every important day, not quite a grandfather and something more than a strange, rich friend, the man who showed up on Thursdays and at recitals and at every single one of her birthdays with flowers from her own shop, which made her laugh every time. He paid for her schooling and pretended it was an advance against future deliveries, and she let him pretend it, because she had learned from the best that there is a difference between charity and a correction, and that a person's pride is worth protecting on both sides of a gift. She took over the shop at 22. By then it supplied flowers to all 41 Vane hotels and a dozen other clients besides, and it employed 9 people, and it had 3 glass houses behind it where there had once been a single row of greenhouse boxes. The yellow raincoat she had worn on the corner that first rainy morning she kept, folded, in a drawer in the back. And the framed crayon drawing, My Friends, 3 figures and a yellow sun pushing through the rain, hung not in the shop but in Augustus Vane's office on the 41st floor for the rest of his life. And when he was gone, it came back to Marlowe Street, and Maya hung it behind the register. And when visitors asked about it, she said only that it was a picture a little girl had drawn a long time ago and left it at that. 8 months after Edith's passing, Augustus established something inside Vane Group and refused to let the marketing department give it a clever name. He called it the Bucket Fund, after a tin bucket on a corner that 2 different women had once stood behind in the rain, 30 years and 1 city apart. The fund offered frozen rents and no-interest advances, and hard introductions to small family businesses in the neighborhoods his company had once simply bought and flattened. Flower shops and bakeries and tailors and corner groceries. The kind of places that are only ever a line on a redevelopment schedule until someone makes themselves read the address. When the board asked him what the name meant, he said it was a private matter and moved to the next item, and only Maya, sitting in the 3rd row at the announcement in a blazer she'd bought with her own paycheck, knew the whole of it. When his gaze swept the room and landed on her for exactly 1 second, she nodded just once, just enough, and that was all the 2 of them ever needed to say about it. He was not a charity. He told anyone who would listen right up to the end. He was a man who had spent 30 years behind glass and gotten out, late but not too late, because one rainy morning a little girl in a yellow raincoat had held up a bunch of white flowers and asked him, without knowing she was asking, the only question that had ever mattered. Are you going to stop, or are you going to keep driving past? Many years later, Maya Quinn was driving across the city on a gray Tuesday morning when the sky opened up. Not the slow, steady kind of rain, but the other kind. The sudden, furious, personal kind that turned the wipers useless and the streetlights into smeared ghosts behind sheets of water. She was on the avenue that ran past the old district, in a reliable car with the heater humming and the seats warm, the same stretch of road where, a lifetime ago, a charcoal Bentley had once idled at a curb while a man behind tinted glass argued with himself about whether to feel anything at all. And then she saw her. A little girl on the corner, 7, maybe 8. Brown skin, hair in 2 careful braids gone heavy with rain, a coat the wrong weight for the weather, and at her feet an overturned crate with a bucket on top, and over the bucket a little tent of clear plastic, and beneath the plastic, Maya knew without needing to see them, flowers. The child was bent over the bucket like a question mark, checking that the plastic held, that the rain ran off and not in, keeping the flowers dry and letting herself get soaked, because that was the arrangement that had always been the arrangement in this city in the rain, for as long as there had been little girls and buckets and grandmothers who needed something the flowers might pay for. Maya's foot found the brake before her mind formed a thought. She pulled to the curb. She rolled down the window. And she did not sit behind the glass and watch, the way a man had once watched her grandmother and once almost watched her, did not weigh it, did not test it, did not wonder what it might cost or what she might gain. She had been taught the lesson too well by an old woman in a shawl and a billionaire in a ruined coat to ever need to learn it twice. "Hey," Maya called over the roar of the rain. "Those real flowers." The little girl looked up, wary, sizing up the stranger in the warm car the way the children of hard mornings always do. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "My grandma grew 'em. They don't smell like the fake kind." "I know they don't," Maya said. "How much for the white ones?" $2 a bunch. You buy 3, the 4th one's free." The girl lifted her chin. "It's good business. Makes the customer feel like they won something." Maya laughed, and it came out a little broken, because the rain on the windshield and the rain on her own face had gotten confused for a moment. "Your grandmother sounds like she knows business," she said. "She knows everything," the little girl said. "I'll take all of them," Maya said. "Every bunch in the bucket, and then I want you to get in this car out of the rain and tell me where your grandmother's shop is, because I'd like to meet a woman who taught a kid to keep the white ones dry." She reached across and pushed open the passenger door. "Come on. I've been exactly where you're standing, I promise you that." The little girl hesitated, looked at the warm, dry seat at the open door, at the woman behind the wheel whose eyes held something she couldn't name but somehow completely trusted. And then she carefully lifted her bucket, climbed in, settled the flowers on her lap so they wouldn't tip, and pulled the door shut against the storm. Maya pulled back onto the road. Wipers beat their old rhythm, the heater wrapped around both of them, and for a few blocks neither of them spoke, and then the little girl said quietly, "Nobody usually stops in the rain." "No," Maya said, "they don't. But somebody stopped for me once, and somebody stopped for my grandmother before that, even if it took him a while to get out of the car." She glanced at the child, at the flowers held safe and dry on a small lap, at the 2 careful braids and the lifted chin. "So now I stop. Every time, that's the whole thing, that's all it ever was." She understood it now in a way she had only half understood as a girl, the lesson it had taken Augustus Vane 30 years and a rainy morning to learn, and that he had spent the rest of his life trying to pass on. You don't have to watch a person through glass to find out what they're worth. You don't have to test them or follow them or wait to see what they do when they think no one is looking. You just have to stop the car. The distance between where a person is and where they belong is not measured in miles or in dollars or in anything you can count from behind a window. It is measured in the number of people willing to pull over in the rain and say the only words that have ever truly mattered. "Get in. I see you." A billionaire had once watched a little girl from his car and very nearly drove past, and the not driving past had remade his entire life. Now a woman who had once been that little girl stopped without a flicker of hesitation, because she had been taught by the 2 best teachers she would ever have that this, and not the watching, and not the wealth, and not the long-ago bucket on a corner, was the whole of it. So she drove the child home through the storm, to a grandmother and a warm shop and a future that had just, without either of them quite knowing it yet, gotten a great deal brighter. and the rain that had once tried to stop them both came down on the roof of the warm car and could not touch a single thing inside it. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you of someone who stopped for you when they didn't have to, or someone you could still stop for, share it with them. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and I'll see you on the next one.